Good evening and welcome to Red Lantern Analytica's Q&A session titled The Tibet Factor. We have with us Grace Chima and Shiveti who will be answering a few questions on Tibet and Dalai Lama, who is the world's most respected spiritual leader and who turned 85 yesterday. How important do you think Dalai Lama is to Tibet? Shiveti, could I request to start off with a brief introduction on Dalai Lama?
Sure, Sheetal. Yeah, am I audible?
We can hear you, Sheetal.
Yeah, okay, fine. When one speaks of Dalai Lama, one generally speaks of the symbols of love, compassion, resilience, a patient world, a peaceful one world. So many people confuse the Dalai Lama with the name of a person, wherein it actually is a spiritual title endowed by the Tibetans to a person who is considered as the head monk of Tibetan Buddhism, as well as the traditional guide of the region. There have been 14 Dalai Lamas till date, with the current Dalai Lama having been announced his retirement in the year 2011. The current Dalai Lama, whose actual name is Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, has been in exile in India since 1959 now, after he was forced to flee China due to Chinese aggression in Tibet. Now, coming to the next part of your question, Sheetal, regarding the traditional institutional working of the Tibetan Buddhist system. So, it basically involves the evolution of a unique Tibetan tradition of recognizing the reincarnations of scholar adept, and that has been of immense help to both the Dharma and sentient beings, particularly to the monastic community. The Dalai Lamas have functioned as both the political and spiritual leaders of Tibet for 369 years now. According to Buddhist belief, the current Dalai Lama is a reincarnation of a past Lama who decided to be reborn again to continue his important work. Also, a person who decides to be continually reborn is known as Tulku, which is spelled as Tulku. And the Buddhists believe that the fourth Tulku in this reincarnation was Gedan Druk, if I may pronounce it right, who became the first Dalai Lama. So, after the death of Dalai Lama, it has traditionally been the responsibility of High Lamas of the Gelugpa traditional schools and the Tibetan government to find his reincarnation. The High Lamas search for a boy who was born around the same time as the death of Dalai Lama. It can take around 2 to 3 years to identify the Dalai Lama, and for the current 14th Dalai Lama, it took almost about 4 years. So there are several ways in which the High Lamas might find out where the next reincarnation will be found. So some of them comprise of dream. So one of the High Lamas may dream about some mark or location that will identify the boy, or smoke. So if the previous Dalai Lama was cremated, High Lamas will watch the direction of the smoke and search accordingly. Or through some visions or other search indication in a holy lake called Lamu Lapso, which lies in central Tibet. So the village of Tenzin Gyatso, the current Dalai Lama, was identified through this method. So yeah, Sheetal.
Right, moving on. So, Grace, this question is for you. What are your views on the way that Tibet impacts India China border conflicts?
See, for most of its history, Tibet was a buffer zone between India and China. So, India, Nepal, Bhutan, none of these countries even shared a border with China in the first place until China annexed Tibet in 1950. So, until its occupation by China, Tibet was an independent protectorate. And the border between India and Tibet was delineated as the Mekmian line under the 1914 Shimla Accord. Now, here's where things get interesting. China recognizes the Mekmian line with Myanmar, but it does not recognize it with India. And the reason behind that is that Tibet was a signatory of the agreement. It was altogether a separate party than China, which did not ratify it. So for China, accepting the Mekmian line means accepting that Tibet was in fact an independent nation. And that is unacceptable for China, of course. So there was no such thing as India-China border issues until the Chinese occupation of Tibet. Now, the Tibetans did revolt against Chinese forces in 1959, which was covertly supported by the United States too. And India granted political asylum to the Dalai Lama and thousands of other Tibetans who were forced to flee to India. So right after that, A lot of propaganda was let loose against India in the Chinese press, and this is when border infiltrations in the northeast frontier as well as Jammu and Kashmir happened from the Chinese side, and these continue to this day. Matter of fact, the then Prime Premier of China even admitted that there was a direct link between these incidents and the Tibetan uprising. Mao's own statements refer to Tibet as the right hand palm, with Ladakh, Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh, Bhutan, and Nepal as the five fingers, where China's expansionist policies were to take root. And this is exactly what we see today, right? China is gradually impinging on all these five areas. So the Tibet issue is deeply linked to the India-China border issue. In fact, the Tibetan government in exile still says that the resolution of the Tibet issue is the resolution of India-China border issues. Back to you, Sheetal.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. The disputes along the border between India and China remain unresolved, and that's in a lot of different contexts, and may even remain so for years to come. Shiveti, would you like to elucidate on any one out of the many contentious issues that exist between India and China?
Yeah, sure, Sheetal. So, apart from the potential border conflicts that have been majorly discussed about, the standoffs seem to have led to a dispute over another upcoming and a very less talked about issue, and that is water. So, see, the Brahmaputra River is one of Asia's major rivers originating in Tibet and flowing down to India before entering Bangladesh, where it joins the Ganges and drains into the Bay of Bengal. So that's about the geography of the river. So now the Brahmaputra gets severely flooded during monsoons every year, causing huge losses in northeast India and Bangladesh. The two countries have agreements though with China that requires the upstream country to share hydrological data of the river during monsoons. I guess it's between 15th May to 15th October, the monsoonal season. Following this, in 2017, China said that its hydrological stations were being upgraded because of which it couldn't share the data, which was asked by India. So, but at the same time, and India believed it until the time when when it was disclosed that China continued to share the data for the same river with Bangladesh. So this particular issue becomes important since in recent years, particularly northeastern India, fears have been growing that China could anytime suddenly release a huge amount of water. So there have been also increasing incidents of landslides, blocking rivers, and sudden floods in the Himalayas. So China has already constructed several hydropower dams on the river. At the same time, Delhi has also been asking for the data for non-monsoonal flows of the river because there are suspicions that China could divert the waters of Brahmaputra to its parched regions. China has also now plans to build 4 more dams on the Brahmaputra River, which renders both Bangladesh and India worrying that these dams will give China the ability to divert to store water in times of political crisis, right? So this is how, under such circumstances, inevitably, it becomes very important tool in the hands of Chinese government to take control of the border areas. And the northeastern states in India, and it's high time for India also to have some common solutions, one of which may be of developing some bilateral or multilateral treaties along with the existing memorandums, like the one that it has with Pakistan, like the Indus Water Treaty. So yeah, that is about it, Sheetal.
Right. On a rather similar note, if the 14th Dalai Lama were to be the last Dalai Lama, how do you think a post Dalai Lama world will look like? And this question, any please go ahead.
See, post the 14th Dalai Lama, two situations might arise. Now, it's possible that the Tibetan struggle actually wanes out, so it fades away gradually in the absence of a spiritual leader. But at the same time, it's also possible that it becomes a lot more radicalized. Traditionally, like Shiveti mentioned before, the Dalai Lama gives instructions regarding his reincarnation, and the Panchen Lama, who ranks second to the Dalai Lama, is the one who recognizes his reincarnation. So 3 days after the 11th Panchen Lama was identified, the Chinese security forces abducted the 6-year-old, and we haven't heard from the Panchen Lama ever since. So there's that. Now, the current Dalai Lama says that his next reincarnation will be in a free country, which might as well be India, but it's unlikely to be China. He's also gone one step ahead in saying that there is the possibility that he might not have any further reincarnation at all. And if that is the case, then the Dalai Lama institution will be completely abolished thereafter. In the absence of their spiritual leader, the Tibetan government in exile is certain to come under a lot of pressure, and the movement, which so far has been non-violent, might actually lose that non-violent aspect. Besides, the political powers of the Dalai Lama have already been resigned in 2011, if I'm not wrong. And at the same time, the PRC passed a law which advocates for approval from the Chinese government of any reincarnations of any Buddhist monk. So it's highly likely that we end up with two Dalai Lamas, one that is appointed by the Tibet Buddhist institution and the other by the Chinese government. Now, it goes without saying here that the latter will not garner a lot of legitimacy in this case. For instance, earlier this year, the US House of Representatives passed a bill which stated that China will be subject to sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act if it all tries to interfere in the process of recognizing the next Dalai Lama. So all of this, accompanied by a maybe violent Tibetan struggle, is bound to be a major security threat for China. And if that happens, then a heavily militarized Tibet is quite likely.
Right, since you mentioned Panchen Lama, do you think his disappearance was an attempt by the Chinese to dismantle Tibetan Buddhism through interference?
Could you come again, Sheetal?
Since you mentioned Panchen Lama, do you think his disappearance was an attempt by the Chinese to dismantle the Tibetan Buddhism through interference?
Oh, of course it is. In fact, the reason behind the entire revolt of 1951 was because the Tibetans have felt a profound sense of loss of identity. The Chinese authorities have been trying to slowly nibble away at this institution and reinstitute that with a Chinese patriotic narrative. So this actually points to human rights violations, and that they started as soon as the Chinese troops invaded the nation. Individual rights and rights of the Tibetans as a whole, as a people, were all trampled. There still is this same sense of loss of religion and the distinct identity that the Tibetans have. The Tibetan uprising was brutally repressed. Thousands of monks have been taken as political prisoners. Thousands of monasteries have been destroyed. China launched a strike hard campaign where about 30,000 monks and nuns were given what is called patriotic re-education, which I believe the Panchen Lama was a part of. And they were all forced to sign political allegiances. There was no freedom of speech. There still is no freedom of speech. You can get arrested for so much as celebrating the Dalai Lama's birthday. So also it's very difficult to gauge the extent of these violations in the first place because there is no freedom of expression. As a result, more than 150 Tibetans have resorted to self-immolation to protest these policies. Just a few days back, Chinese authorities forced down Tibetan prayer flags and destroyed the poles that hold these flags. And all of this was done under the mask of an environmental cleanup campaign. There are hundreds of organizations and institutions which advocate to secure human rights for Tibetans. I mentioned earlier that the US House of Representatives has passed the Tibet Human Rights Bill this year. The issue has also been taken up in the United Nations. So the only voice for the Tibetan population is the one that is present in the free world.
Right. Shiveti, would you like to add to this, please?
Yeah, sure, Sheetal. So I can start by giving a brief introduction of who's Panchen Lama and how is he elected and all. So basically, when we talk about Panchen Lama, he's the second highest spiritual authority in Tibetan Buddhism after the Dalai Lama. So traditionally, the Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama recognize each other's reincarnations. After the death of 10th Panchen Lama in 1989, his reincarnation was identified through traditional Tibetan Buddhist method as Gedun Choki Nima. I may have pronounced it wrong. Pardon me. So yeah, and recognized on he was recognized on May 14, 1995, by the 14th Dalai Lama. Soon after which he, along with his family, got kidnapped by the Chinese government, as Grace had pointed out previously. So he was just 6 years old at that time, and since then until now he's missing. On the contrary, the Chinese government later promoted its proxy, Gyalpe Norbu, to act as if he were the Panchen Lama, which was but obviously not accepted by the Tibetan state authorities, right? And the people also. So since then, numerous governments and organizations, including the European Parliament, Canada, UK, US, India, the several UN committees, etc., have repeatedly called to China for the Panchen Lama's release, but it won't listen. So now, following this background, let's now have a look over the reasons for China to create such a huge criminal controversy, thereby creating two Panchen Lamas with barely caring about its national ethos and international morals. So, the deployment of the higher lamas are mostly carried forward by the other lamas. As discussed above, the selection of Panchen Lamas are essentially done by the existing Dalai Lama and the other high Buddhist officials, and vice versa, is the process of selecting the next Dalai Lama. This is the process where the whole game rests. That is, by creating its own Panchen Lama, China is aiming for the election of the next Dalai Lama after after the death of present Dalai Lama. So it's been aiming that high, because once the Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama, both the positions and the titles are under its control, it takes one more step towards occupying Tibet and winning the hearts of the people. So that is a game which it has been playing and aiming since years. Yeah, Sheetal.
All right, all right. That's a very interesting talk.
Yeah, it is. It
With
is.
the ongoing Republican lawmakers got ready to put a bill earlier this year to authorize the president to recognize Tibet autonomous region of the People's Republic of China as a separate independent country. On that, Grace, what are your comments?
I'd say the bill has been very well received by Tibetans. It's been seen as a win for the Tibetan independence movement. But at the same time, I feel it has to be kept in mind that the bill is yet to become a law. It has to first pass through the House of Representatives and the Senate and then be signed by the president before it becomes an actual law. Even so, even if the law is passed, it's unlikely that the US will actually do something to enforce the issue. Nonetheless, just the recognition and even just the introduction of such a law holds a lot of value for the Tibetan people. In fact, it's also galvanized the Uyghurs to urge the United States for similar actions in the same line. Another thing I'd say that has to be noted here is the manner in which the bill is worded. It calls for recognizing the Tibet Autonomous Region as an independent country. The concept of the Tibet Autonomous Region excludes areas like Amdo, which Tibetans believe is a part of their land. So the concept has been propounded by the Chinese narrative rather than the Tibetan narrative. And in excluding these areas, the bill indirectly or perhaps unintentionally validates the Chinese narrative. So while the bill has been welcomed, recognizing these excluded regions as a part of Tibet would definitely make the bill a lot more comprehensive.
Right, right, very well. You so with that, to our last question, our concluding question, and that is that according to you, Shiveti, how is Dalai Lama the bone of contention in India, Tibet, and
Yeah, Sheetal. Now, this is where the crux of the discussion lies. Dalai Lama, as discussed earlier, acts as a symbol of unification of Tibet, right? So, his political and religious and spiritual influence has been of a great deal for both the people of Tibet and for the government of China. Besides sharing trade and border disputes with India, Dalai Lama's mere existence and Tibetan people's government in exile has been another major bone of contention for China. China, which claims Tibet as its own territory, considers Dalai Lama as a separatist, to no one's surprise. So now India till date has been having a very implicit stand on Dalai Lama, although it has been supporting both Dalai Lama and the setting up of Tibetan settlements, as well as the creation of Tibetan schools and so that the culture and the language could be preserved, right? It has yet not taken a very open stand in the international arena on this matter, since that would directly, I guess, indicate the state's notion of going against China. There are many examples that India reflects its dwindling stand on the issue. For example, if we think about in 2017, China raised objections to the Dalai Lama's visit in Tawang. Its place in Arunachal Pradesh. So China termed Dalai Lama's visit as a provocation by India, to which Delhi responded by saying that Dalai Lama is a holy figure who is respected by Indians, and no additional flavor should be, added to the visit. As opposed to this, in 2018, surprisingly, New Delhi took a different stand. And when Central Tibetan administration was about to hold the interfaith prayers, the thank you functions in Delhi, they were denied. So, along with this, India has also not much talked about the search of the next Dalai Lama in India, which Grace had pointed out when Dalai Lama suggested that his next reincarnation may be in India, which was predicted by him though. And China, on this thought, China openly claimed this, that openly asked India to stay away from this particular issue. But India was quiet on it. I mean, it did not comment much on it. So this is how India, since the very beginning, has over the period refrained itself from making any strong statement on the issue of Tibet and bringing up the matter in talks with China. Though Tibetans have always looked upon India as a big supporter of their cause for but obvious reasons. And it has also been like India has also been implicitly supporting the Tibetans and their stay in India since years now. It's been 6 decades. So yeah, on to Vishal.
Right. Very well. That brings us to the end of our Q&A. But before we end this session, let's jump into a time of reflection and take a look at the topics that we covered today. Shall we? So we started off the Q&A with a brief cultural context that surrounds Dalai Lama and his traditional functioning. Grace, in quite an insightful manner, put forth her views on Tibet's influence over India-China border, followed by Shiveti's explicit mention on water disputes that exists between the countries. Further, we stepped a bit in a situational context that paraded over a post-Dalai Lama theme. Also touched upon the controversy that surrounds Panchen Lama's disappearance. Then we moved on to the US Congress's bill to recognize Tibet as an independent country, as well as Tibetan humanitarian crisis that lies within it. In conclusion, Shiveti pointed out how Dalai Lama is the bone of contention between India, Tibet, and China. And with this, we end our session. Thank you, Grace, and thank you, Shiveti, for being here. Let's sign off.
Pleasure, Sheetal.